The screams stopped at dawn. What began as a family homestead became a killing ground that swallowed travelers whole for 30 years, and the truth only surfaced when a single survivor broke free. 1832. The Appalachian frontier stretched like a wound across eastern America, all shadow-thick forests and limestone ridges where the law ended at the county line. In the folds of these mountains, where creeks ran cold and settlements clung to clearings like barnacles, a man named Micah Harrow carved out 200 acres in what would become eastern Kentucky. The land cost him nothing but a forged deed and the willingness to live where others wouldn't. Mist pooled in the valleys each morning, the smell of rotting leaves mixed with wood smoke. Underfoot, the soil gave way soft and black, perfect for burying things. Micah had been a trapper, a failed preacher, a man whose face showed too many teeth when he smiled. His wife Sarah bore him 9 children in 12 years, 6 boys, 3 girls, and each one learned to walk by following their father into the woods. He taught them to skin rabbits before they turned 5, to set snares by 7, to understand that travelers who wandered too far from the Cumberland Gap weren't people at all, but Providence's gift wrapped in wool coats and leather boots. The first kill happened in late autumn of 1837. A peddler named Thomas Wick took the wrong trail off the main road, lured by the promise of a shortcut Micah's eldest son, Caleb, had described in town. Wicky carried tin pots, needles, and $63 in silver, a fortune that far from civilization. He never reached the next settlement. According to a fragmentary journal later discovered in a root cellar, Caleb wrote, "Father says waste nothing. Boots fit Daniel. Coins buried near the old oak." The entry was dated November 9th, 1837. Wicky was 19 years old. No one came looking. In the Appalachian hollers of the 1830s, people vanished all the time, swallowed by ravines, taken by fever, or simply deciding the next valley over looked more promising. The Harrows learned that anonymity was armor, and isolation was license. Where do you watch from, and what hour strikes your clock right now? If this story chills you, leave a like and subscribe, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Micah formalized the system by 1840. His sons ranged in age from 8 to 17. The girls, Martha, Edith, and Ruth, were tasked with appearing harmless, sometimes sent into nearby towns to gather intelligence on travelers, merchants, or surveyors who might be passing through alone. The boys learned ambush points, the creek ford where horses slowed, the switchback trail where a fallen tree forced riders to dismount, the narrow pass where a landslide could look accidental. Micah drilled them like soldiers. If you hesitated, you starved. If you succeeded, you feasted. The family killed, selectively, never locals, never groups larger than 3. Only transients whose disappearance would spark questions 100 miles away, in counties that had no jurisdiction and no resources to investigate. Witnesses in nearby settlements later recalled the Harrows as quiet, odd, but never threatening. One shopkeeper remembered young Caleb buying salt and nails with coins so old they bore Spanish engravings. When asked where his family got such currency, Caleb shrugged and said his grandfather had been a sailor. People believed what was easiest. By 1845, the Harrow children weren't children anymore. They were a coordinated pack, efficient and cold, moving through the forests like something feral that had learned to mimic human speech. Micah had refined their doctrine into something almost religious. The world was predator and prey, and God favored those willing to choose their role. He read scripture at supper, selections cherry-picked to justify dominion vengeance, survival. His voice carried through the cabin, mixing with the crackle of the hearth and the smell of meat no one asked about too closely. They called it harvest season. Historians estimate, based on fragmentary records, missing persons reports filed across 4 states, and skeletal remains eventually unearthed, that the Harrow family killed at least 47 people between 1837 and 1863. The true number is likely higher. Some victims carried nothing worth keeping except their silence. What makes a child capable of this? Micah didn't raise his sons and daughters as monsters. He raised them as farmers who understood that survival required slaughter, and sentiment was a luxury only the weak could afford. To them, a traveler caught in a snare was no different than a deer. You used what you could. You wasted nothing. But systems built on blood have a way of cracking from within. By 1860, 2 of Micah's sons had died, one from infection after a victim fought back, another in a logging accident that may not have been accidental at all. The daughters had been married off to neighboring families who knew better than to ask questions. That left Caleb, Daniel, and the youngest son, a boy named Josiah, who had been 9 when the killing began and was now 32, hollow-eyed and prone to talking to himself in the woods. Josiah was the weak link. He always had been. And in the spring of 1863, he would become the family's executioner. But before we reach that reckoning, you need to understand how deeply the rot had spread and how many people chose to look away. What would you do if you suspected your neighbors were killers, but proving it meant risking everything you had? The sheriff knew. That single fact unravels every comfortable assumption about justice in the American frontier and reveals how evil thrives when good people decide it's easier to stay quiet. 1856, a postal inspector named Edward Grimes arrived in Harlan County with a list of 23 missing mail carriers who had vanished along routes threading through the eastern mountains over the past decade. His investigation lasted 6 weeks. He interviewed merchants, stable owners, and local law enforcement. He mapped disappearances against terrain, weather patterns, and known trouble spots. Every line of inquiry curved back toward the same remote hollow where the Harrow family lived, like a closed fist. Grimes filed his report with the regional marshal's office on October 14, 1856. In it, he wrote, "Strong circumstantial evidence suggests coordinated predation in the area surrounding Harrow Creek. Recommend immediate investigation with federal authority." The report was acknowledged, filed, and ignored. Grimes himself disappeared 3 months later while traveling back through Kentucky. His body was never found. His saddlebags, however, turned up in a Lexington pawn shop 2 years afterward, sold by a young man matching Caleb Harrow's description. No one was arrested. No one was questioned. The file was closed due to insufficient evidence and lack of witnesses. Sheriff Thomas Breckinridge ran Harlan County from 1852 to 1864. By all accounts, he was a competent lawman. He settled land disputes, tracked down horse thieves, and kept the peace during election seasons when tempers ran hot. He also received an anonymous stipend twice yearly, paid in silver coins and delivered by a boy who never gave his name. One of Breckinridge's deputies, a man named William Caudle, later testified that the sheriff had once told him plainly, "The Harrows keep to themselves. They don't bother townfolk. That's equilibrium, and equilibrium is what keeps this county from tearing itself apart." Translation: as long as the Harrows only killed strangers, the sheriff considered it someone else's problem. The smell of complicity hung over those mountains like smoke. Thick, inescapable. The kind of thing you notice only after you've been breathing it for years. Townspeople weren't stupid. They heard the rumors. Travelers who went into the highlands and never emerged. Peddlers whose routes ended abruptly. Surveyors whose equipment was later sold at suspiciously low prices by men with mountain accents. But raising an alarm meant inviting trouble. It meant federal marshals, questions about who knew what and when, potential reprisals from a family known to hold grudges across generations. Easier to chalk it up to bad luck, dangerous terrain, the general chaos of frontier life. Besides, the Harrows contributed to the local economy. They bought supplies, paid in cash, and never caused disturbances in town. Caleb Harrow once helped pull a child from a frozen creek, an act of heroism that locals still remembered fondly 20 years later. How could a man who saved a drowning girl also be a killer? People believe what allows them to sleep at night. The horror hid in plain sight. 1859. A Methodist circuit preacher named Reverend Amos Gill spent 3 days at the Harrow homestead during a particularly harsh winter. He later wrote in his personal diary, "Welcomed with great hospitality." The father quotes scripture liberally, though his interpretations trouble me. Notice the children have a strange way of watching strangers, like dogs assessing whether to obey or attack. Slept poorly. Departed at first light despite their insistence I stay longer. Gill noted something else, almost as an afterthought. He counted 11 coats hanging near the door, far more than the family would need, in styles ranging from gentleman's wool to tradesman's canvas. When he casually asked about it, Micah explained they collected cast-offs from travelers who found themselves overburdened. The explanation made sense, just barely. Gill never reported his suspicions. In his final entry about the visit, dated February 3, 1859, he wrote, "Perhaps I am seeing shadows where none exist. The frontier makes phantoms of us all." He chose doubt over action. Most people did. Neighboring families operated on a code of willful ignorance. You didn't ask the Harrows where their money came from. You didn't inquire about the smoke that rose from their property at odd hours, or the times when their youngest son, Josiah, would show up in town looking haunted, flinching at loud noises, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. One farmer whose land bordered Harrow territory later admitted he'd found human teeth mixed with animal bones in a creek that ran between their properties. He buried them and never spoke of it until 1864, after everything had already collapsed. Why didn't he report it? "Because I had a wife and 3 daughters," he said, "and the Harrows knew where we lived." Fear is a currency. The Harrows spent it wisely. But fear alone doesn't sustain a killing operation for 3 decades. The family's longevity depended on something more insidious. The victims themselves were invisible. They were drifters, immigrants, freed slaves traveling north, people whose absence left no political pressure, no influential families demanding answers. In the moral calculus of 1850s America, these lives simply weighed less. If a wealthy merchant's son had vanished, the mountains would have been flooded with pauses. Because the victims were nobodies, the investigation never came. Micah Harrow understood this. He preyed on the margins, where society's gaze never quite focused. By 1862, the Civil War had turned the Appalachian region into a fractured no-man's land. Confederate and Union forces both moved through Kentucky in irregular patterns, requisitioning supplies, conscripting men, and leaving devastation in their wake. Deserters from both armies fled into the mountains. Some stumbled into Harrow territory. None stumbled out. The war provided perfect cover. A man found dead in the woods could be a casualty of guerrilla warfare. a deserter shot by his own side, or just another victim of the chaos that swallowed the region. Even if someone had wanted to investigate the Harrows, there were no resources, no functioning courts, no unified law enforcement. Micah's operation reached its apex. His sons moved like ghosts through the forest, and the body count climbed into numbers we'll never fully know. But Josiah, the youngest, the one who had never quite hardened the way his father demanded, was beginning to crack. How long can you participate in horror before it rewrites who you are? Before the line between victim and perpetrator dissolves entirely? Josiah was about to find out, and his breaking point would bring the entire blood-soaked dynasty to its knees. Josiah stopped sleeping in the cabin. That single behavioral shift should have warned his family that the machinery of obedience was failing. But by 1863, everyone was too deep in the pattern to notice one man unraveling. Spring arrived late that year. Ice still crusted the creek banks in early April, and the trees remained skeletal against a sky the color of old iron. Josiah had taken to spending nights in a lean-to he'd built half a mile from the main house, claiming he preferred solitude for trapping. His father allowed it. Micah was 61 now, joints stiff with arthritis, vision dimming. He delegated most of the operational planning to Caleb, who ran the ambushes with mechanical precision. Daniel handled disposal, the digging, the burning, the careful scattering of remains where scavengers would finish the work. Josiah's role had always been reconnaissance. He scouted the roads, identified potential targets, reported back with numbers and vulnerabilities. He was good at it because he looked harmless. Thin, slouched, with a face that registered as forgettable. Travelers would answer his questions without suspicion. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. But something had shifted inside him after the war started. Maybe it was the sheer volume. 3 years of increased traffic through the mountains meant more opportunities, more bodies, more nights lying awake listening to his brothers sharpen their knives. Or maybe it was the girl. Her name was Anna Moritz. She was 17. They killed her on March 28, 1863. Anna had been traveling with her older brother, a Union deserter named Friedrich, who was trying to get them both to Ohio, where distant relatives lived. They'd taken a wrong turn off the main trail, lured by Josiah's directions toward what he'd described as a friendly homestead that might spare food and shelter. Friedrich died quickly. Caleb's rifle shot took him through the chest before he could dismount his horse. But Anna ran. She made it almost a quarter mile before Daniel caught her. Josiah had been positioned as a blocker on the far end of the ambush zone, meant to intercept anyone who fled. When Anna came crashing through the underbrush, he'd stood there frozen, watching her desperate sprint through the trees. Their eyes met for less than a second. She was crying. Mud streaked her face. Her dress had torn on branches. He let her pass. Daniel tackled her 30 yards later, dragged her back to where Caleb was stripping Friedrich's body of anything valuable. What happened next took 11 minutes. Josiah forced himself to watch all of it. Some self-imposed penance, a psychological flagellation that only deepened the wound. When it was over, Anna's body was dumped in the same ravine as her brother's, and Caleb clapped Josiah on the shoulder with blood still drying on his hands. "Getting squeamish?" Caleb had asked, grinning. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. Josiah didn't answer. He walked back to his lean-to and didn't speak for 3 days. The human mind has a breaking capacity, a threshold where the weight of accumulated horror exceeds the structure's ability to bear it. Psychologists wouldn't develop the language for moral injury until the 20th century, But Josiah was experiencing its full force in 1863. He'd participated in killings since childhood, more than 30 by his own later estimation. But Anna's death functioned differently. Maybe because she'd looked at him with hope before realizing he was part of the trap. Maybe because she reminded him of his youngest sister. Maybe because 33 years of suppressed conscience chose that moment to detonate. He began visiting the ravine where they'd left her. Not to pray, Josiah had stopped believing in his father's twisted theology years ago, but to bear witness, to prove to himself that it had happened, that she had been real. On one of these visits, he found her locket half buried in the mud. It contained a painted miniature of a woman who must have been her mother, and a lock of dark hair tied with blue thread. He kept it. The first object he'd ever taken from a victim that wasn't meant for survival. Conscience is a landmine buried in the soul. Caleb noticed the change. He'd always been the enforcer of family loyalty, the one who watched for weakness the way a wolf watches for lameness in the herd. One evening in late April, he cornered Josiah near the woodpile and asked point blank if he was having doubts. Josiah lied, said he was fine, said the war had him on edge, same as everyone. Caleb studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Father's getting old," he said quietly. "Soon it'll be just us running things. Can't have anyone going soft. You understand?" The message was clear. Fall in line or become a liability. And liabilities didn't last long in the Harrow family. But Josiah had already made his decision, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. The night after that conversation, he packed a small bag with dried meat, a flint striker, and the locket. He intended to leave at dawn, to vanish into the mountains and never look back. Then the strangers arrived. May 6th, 1863, approximately 2 in the afternoon. A group of 4 Confederate cavalry scouts lost contact with their unit and took refuge in the Harrow Hollow, following smoke from the chimney. They weren't travelers to be robbed. They were armed soldiers, exhausted and paranoid, looking for a place to rest before rejoining their regiment. Micah welcomed them with his usual false warmth, offered food and a place to sleep. Josiah watched the setup unfold with sick familiarity. His father and brothers were going to kill them. 4 armed men, yes, but they'd be ambushed in their sleep, throats cut before they could reach their weapons. It was a proven method. Caleb was already sharpening his blade. Josiah waited until midnight. The soldiers were asleep in the barn. Caleb and Daniel had taken first watch, positioned to move in at Micah's signal. Josiah approached the barn from the blind side, slipped through a gap in the boards, and shook the nearest soldier awake. "You need to leave," he whispered. "Right now. Don't ask questions. Just go." The soldier, a sergeant named Hayes, according to later testimony, grabbed his revolver and nearly shot Josiah on instinct. But something in the younger man's face, the raw terror and urgency, made him hesitate. Josiah explained in frantic, broken sentences. His family were killers. They'd murdered dozens. The soldiers would die if they stayed. Hayes woke his men. They moved fast, saddling horses in near silence while Josiah kept watch. By the time Caleb checked on the barn at 12:45 a.m., it was empty except for Josiah, standing in the center holding a pitchfork like a weapon. The confrontation lasted seconds. Caleb understood immediately what had happened. He called for Daniel and their father. Josiah backed toward the door, pitchfork raised, and said the only words that mattered. "I'm done." Micah arrived, torch in hand, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't yell. He simply stated, "You've killed us all. And in a way, he was right. The soldiers didn't believe him at first. That disbelief nearly cost Josiah his life, and it revealed a dark truth about how persuasive normalcy can be, even when a man is literally begging you to see the monster behind the mask. Sergeant Hayes and his 3 cavalry scouts rode hard for 2 hours, putting distance between themselves and the Harrow homestead. They stopped at dawn near a limestone outcropping to water the horses and debate what they'd just heard. According to Hayes's official report, filed May 9, 1863, with his commanding officer in Cumberland Gap, the young man's claims seemed fantastical. He alleged his family had murdered travelers for 30 years, yet provided no proof beyond his own testimony. Private Kellum argued we'd been spooked by a madman. I was inclined to agree. Josiah had followed them on foot, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. When he caught up, he was bleeding from a gash across his forearm. Caleb had tried to stop him from leaving, and the struggle had drawn blood. Josiah collapsed near their fire, gasping, and pulled Anna Moritz's locket from his pocket. Her name was Anna, he said. 17 years old. We killed her and her brother 6 weeks ago. There's a ravine 2 miles east of our property where we dumped the bodies. I can show you. The locket changed everything. It was tangible, specific, attached to a name and a face. Hayes examined the miniature portrait inside, noted the quality of the metalwork. This had belonged to someone with means, not the kind of trinket a poor mountain family would own legitimately. He asked Josiah how many victims. Josiah said he'd stopped counting after 40. Hayes made a command decision. He would investigate, but he needed federal authority and more men. The Confederate cavalry had no jurisdiction over civilian crimes, even in wartime Kentucky. He sent 1 scout riding hard to the nearest Union outpost. The region's allegiances were fluid enough that both armies sometimes coordinated on matters of civil disorder, while he and the remaining 2 soldiers accompanied Josiah back toward Harrow territory. They reached the ravine on May 7th, mid-morning. The smell hit them first. Decomposition in Appalachian spring, damp earth, bacterial bloom. The sweet rot stench of human remains mixing with last year's leaf mulch. Hayes later wrote that Private Kellum vomited twice before they even descended into the gully. What they found there numbered at least 18 distinct skeletons in various stages of decay, along with scattered clothing, personal effects, and bones that had been gnawed by animals. Some skulls showed clear evidence of violent trauma. One rib cage still had a rusted knife blade lodged between the vertebrae. The earth held its secrets poorly. Hayes ordered his men to document everything they could. A grim inventory that included a child's shoe, a wedding band, a leather satchel with German writing on the flap, and numerous buttons, buckles, and bone fragments. They worked for 3 hours while Josiah sat 20 yards away, staring at nothing, occasionally shaking like a man with fever. When they finished, Hayes asked him the question that would echo through every subsequent investigation. Why now? Why betray them after all these years? Josiah's answer was simple. Because I couldn't watch it anymore. And if I stayed, I'd become my father. Fear of transformation. The realization that monstrosity isn't born. It's cultivated, fed, reinforced until it becomes the only language you speak. Josiah had seen his reflection in Anna's dying eyes and understood he was one more killing away from losing whatever remained of his humanity. Hayes sent word through military channels. The response took 6 days to organize. A joint force of 12 Union soldiers and a federal marshal named Clayton Voss, who'd been tracking disappearances in eastern Kentucky since before the war. Voss brought with him a file 4 inches thick. Missing persons reports, abandoned property claims, letters from families who'd lost contact with loved ones traveling through the region. Every thread pointed toward Harlan County. Every trail went cold near Harrow Creek. May 13th, 1863. The posse assembled at dawn. Josiah led them up the mountain paths he'd walked his entire life. Every switchback and creek crossing burned into his memory. He moved mechanically, answering questions in monotone, describing the layout of the property, the positions his brothers typically took, the weapons they kept. Voss noted that Josiah referred to them as the family, never my family. The possessive had been severed. They approached the homestead from two directions, hoping to prevent escape. Marshal Voss called out for the Harrows to surrender peacefully, to come out unarmed for questioning. The response came in the form of rifle fire, Caleb shooting from an upstairs window, the bullet punching through Voss's hat brim and missing his skull by inches. The siege lasted 14 hours. Micah and his two remaining sons had fortified the cabin decades ago against exactly this scenario. Gun slits in the walls, reinforced doors, a root cellar with a tunnel leading to the tree line. They had ammunition, food, and water. They also had nothing to lose. Surrender meant hanging, so they fought with the desperate efficiency of men already dead. The soldiers couldn't risk a frontal assault. The cabin's position on high ground and the firing angles made it a death trap. Instead, they waited, taking shots when they could, trying to pin the Harrows inside. As afternoon bled into evening, smoke began rising from the cabin's stone chimney. Caleb was burning documents, destroying evidence that might implicate others who'd helped or known about their crimes. At 10:37 p.m., the tunnel betrayed them. One of the Union soldiers, a young private named Oster, who'd grown up in similar mountain country, recognized the depression in the ground 40 yards from the cabin, the telltale sag of a collapsed tunnel roof. He positioned himself near the tree line exit and waited. Sure enough, just after 11, Daniel Harrow emerged low and fast, rifle in hand, attempting to flank the posse's position. Oster shot him twice. Daniel made it another 10 feet before he fell, bleeding out in the leaf litter while his brother screamed his name from inside the cabin. The death broke something in Caleb's tactical discipline. He stopped shooting strategically and started firing wild, rage-overwhelming training. Marshal Voss used the distraction to advance with 3 soldiers, reaching the cabin's blind side. They pried open the root cellar entrance and threw in torches. Smoke drives everything out eventually. Micah emerged first, coughing, hands raised, with Caleb behind him still gripping his rifle. Voss ordered them to drop their weapons. Micah complied. Caleb did not. He swung the rifle toward the nearest soldier and managed to fire one shot. It went wide, splintering a tree trunk, before 4 rifles answered simultaneously. Caleb died on his father's doorstep, 3 bullets in his chest, 1 through his throat. Micah Harrow, patriarch and architect of 3 decades of murder, surrendered without further resistance. He was 61 years old, gray-bearded, and when they shackled him, he looked at Josiah for the first time since the siege began. "You were always weak," Micah said, "just like your mother." Josiah didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to a man who'd spent 30 years teaching his children that human life was livestock. But the story didn't end with Micah's arrest, because when the soldiers searched the cabin, they found evidence that suggested the horror ran deeper than anyone had imagined. What they discovered in that root cellar would haunt the investigation for years and raise questions that remain unanswered to this day. The smell underground was different from the ravine. This wasn't the organic decay of bodies returning to earth. This was the concentrated reek of captivity, of human misery trapped in stone and darkness for months or years at a time. Marshal Voss descended into the root cellar on the morning of May 14, 1863, after the smoke had cleared and the bodies had been wrapped. He brought 2 soldiers and a lantern. The tunnel was narrow, reinforced with timber beams, descending at a shallow angle for approximately 30 feet before opening into a chamber roughly 12 feet square. The ceiling was low enough that Voss had to stoop. The walls wept moisture, and carved into the packed earth were niches, dozens of them, filled with objects that told stories no one wanted to hear. Watches, rings, eyeglasses, a baby's rattle, a tintype photograph of a young couple on their wedding day, a compass with initials engraved on the back, a leather journal written in French, its final entry dated September 3rd, 1854. Lost, praying for guidance. Trust the family ahead will help. They hadn't. Voss cataloged 73 distinct personal items that clearly belonged to victims. But it was the other discoveries that transformed the investigation from murder case to something darker. Shackles, bolted into the stone wall, still bearing rust stains that might have been blood. Scratch marks on the wooden support beams, worn deep by fingernails. Some gouges still holding fragments of what looked like skin tissue. And a child's drawing, done in charcoal on the wall near the floor. A stick figure family standing in front of a house, with the word "help" written beneath it in unsteady letters. Someone had been kept alive down here. The implications detonated through the investigation like artillery fire. The working theory had been that the Harrows killed quickly. Ambush, murder, disposal. Efficient, predators. But the evidence suggested something far worse. That some victims had been imprisoned, held in this lightless hole for purposes the investigators could barely bring themselves to hypothesize. When confronted with the findings, Micah Harrow smiled for the first time since his capture. He was being held in a makeshift cell in the town of Harlan, awaiting transport to a federal facility. Marshal Voss demanded answers. Micah provided none, except to say, "A man needs leverage, insurance. You'd be surprised what people will do when you're holding something they love." Voss pressed harder. How many had been kept alive? For how long? What happened to them? Micah stopped smiling. "Ask my children," he said. "They remember better than I do." But his children were dead, except for Josiah, and Josiah claimed he'd never been allowed in the cellar. That had been Micah and Caleb's domain exclusively. Daniel sometimes helped with maintenance, a euphemism that made the soldier's skin crawl. When investigators pushed Josiah for details, he broke down completely, sobbing that he'd heard sounds coming from below the cabin at night, crying, sometimes begging, but had convinced himself it was wind in the tunnel, imagination, anything but the truth he couldn't face. "I knew," Josiah finally admitted. "I didn't go down there, but I knew, and I did nothing." The architecture of complicity has many rooms. Josiah had drawn his moral line at direct participation in torture, but he'd lived above those screams for years and chosen ignorance over intervention. The guilt of that knowledge would follow him for the rest of his life. Federal investigators spent 3 weeks excavating the property. They expanded their search radius to 5 miles, following Josiah's descriptions of secondary disposal sites. The final body count reached 62 confirmed victims based on skeletal remains and personal effects, with an estimated 15 to 20 additional murders that left no recoverable evidence. The victims ranged from children as young as 8 to elderly travelers in their 70s. Roughly 40% were immigrants, German, Irish, Italian, who'd been traveling west with everything they owned, and whose disappearances sparked no organized search because they had no established community to miss them. The Harrows had preyed on the invisible, the expendable, the people America hadn't yet decided were worth protecting. One discovery haunted the investigators more than all the others: a woman's wedding dress, carefully folded in a trunk in the main cabin, sized for someone much smaller than any of Micah's daughters. It was stained with soil and what appeared to be dried blood. Stitched into the hem was a name: Elizabeth Corwin, 1847. Records showed an Elizabeth Corwin had indeed gone missing while traveling from Virginia to Missouri in August of 1847, along with her new husband, Gerald. She'd been 20 years old. The dress suggested she'd been kept alive long enough to have been wearing it underground. What happened to her afterward remained speculation, but the possibilities made even hardened soldiers sick. Marshal Voss interviewed everyone in Harlan County who'd had contact with the Harrows over the past 3 decades. The pattern that emerged was damning not just for the family, but for the community that had enabled them. At least 7 townspeople admitted they'd suspected something wrong, but had rationalized their silence. The sheriff, Thomas Breckenridge, initially denied any knowledge, until investigators found payment records showing he'd received silver coins twice yearly since 1854 from an anonymous source later traced to Caleb Harrow. Breckenridge was arrested as an accessory. He hanged himself in his cell before trial. 2 merchants who'd purchased goods from the Harrows, items clearly too valuable and varied to have been acquired legitimately, were charged with receiving stolen property. One fled the state. The other served 3 years in prison. The moral rot had spread far beyond one family. It had infected the entire hollow, turning neighbors into silent accomplices and lawmen into paid lookouts. The Harrows couldn't have operated for 30 years without a community that chose comfort over confrontation. On June 2, 1863, Micah Harrow was formally charged with 62 counts of murder. His trial lasted 4 days. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. Josiah took the stand and provided details that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The planning sessions, the division of labor, the casual discussions over breakfast about which travelers looked most profitable. The jury deliberated for 37 minutes. Micah was sentenced to hang. When asked if he had any final words before sentencing, he looked directly at his surviving son and said, "Blood calls to blood. You'll understand that someday." Josiah never attended the execution. He'd already given the authorities everything he knew. On July 3, 1863, Micah Harrow was hanged in the town square of Harlan before a crowd of 300. Witnesses reported he showed no remorse, no fear. He died the same way he'd lived, cold, calculating, convinced of his own righteousness. But Micah's death didn't end the Harrow bloodline. And the question that would haunt investigators, historians, and the families of victims for the next century and a half was this: had they really caught everyone? Because in the chaos of the siege, amid the smoke and gunfire and confusion, one detail had been overlooked, a detail that wouldn't surface until decades later, when a box of confiscated family documents was finally examined. Micah Harrow had fathered 10 children, not 9. The birth record surfaced in 1908, 45 years too late. A county clerk reorganizing archived documents discovered a water-damaged ledger from 1843, and on a page brittle with age was an entry that should have rewritten the entire investigation. Harrow, infant male, born March 7th, no name recorded. Mother Sarah Harrow, father Micah Harrow, a 10th child. born between Caleb and Daniel, never mentioned in any testimony, never accounted for during the siege, never found among the dead. The discovery triggered a flurry of archival research. Historians combed through what little remained of Harrow family records. Most had been burned during the siege or destroyed in the subsequent investigation. They found scattered references in county documents. A purchase of children's clothing in 1844 sized for multiple ages. A doctor's bill from 1846 for treatment of the youngest boy. And most unnervingly, a notation in a traveling preacher's journal from 1851 describing the Harrow family as having 8 children present, though the father mentioned a 9th who was indisposed. Not dead, indisposed. Josiah was interviewed again in 1909, by then an old man living under an assumed name in western Pennsylvania. He'd spent 46 years trying to outrun his surname, working as a carpenter, never marrying, never having children of his own. When confronted with the birth record, he went silent for a long time. Then he said something that investigators initially dismissed as the confused memory of an elderly man. There was another boy, Thomas. We weren't allowed to talk about him. Some secrets fester in silence for generations. According to Josiah's fragmented recollection, he was only 9 when Thomas disappeared. His older brother had been different from birth. Weak-minded, Micah had called him, though today we might recognize the description as developmental disability or perhaps autism. Thomas couldn't speak clearly, struggled with physical coordination, and most critically, for a family built on predation, showed empathy toward strangers. Micah Harrow had no use for a son who couldn't kill. Josiah remembered Thomas being kept separate from the other children, housed in a small outbuilding near the tree line. He remembered Caleb once saying Thomas wasn't right and would bring danger to the family if anyone found out about him. And he remembered, with the hazy uncertainty of childhood memory, a night in late autumn of 1852 when Thomas was led into the woods by their father and older brothers. Thomas never came back. Josiah had assumed his brother was killed, buried somewhere in the mountains like so many others. The family never spoke his name again. It was as if Thomas Harrow had been erased from existence, a failed experiment in the breeding of murderers. But the assumption of death was just that, an assumption. No one had ever found a grave. And in the decades following the Harrow trials, strange reports began accumulating in Appalachian folklore, stories that were dismissed as mountain superstition but shared a disturbing consistency. Travelers in the region around former Harrow territory reported encounters with a wild man living in the deep forest, tall, skeletal, moving through the trees with inhuman speed, watching from the shadows but never approaching. Hunters found primitive shelters built from branches and stolen materials, always abandoned by the time they were discovered. Livestock went missing from farms near the old hollow, taken cleanly without the messy work of natural predators. And children, specifically young children playing near the forest edge, reported a tall, scary man who watched them but ran away when adults appeared. The stories persisted through the 1870s, 80s, and into the early 20th century. Most locals dismissed them as ghost tales, the kind of legend that accumulates around any site of historical violence. But a few investigators, amateur historians, and obsessed researchers began to wonder, what if Thomas Harrow had survived? What if he'd been abandoned in the mountains rather than killed, left to fend for himself in the wilderness? A child raised by killers, but not allowed to participate, then cast out and forced to survive alone. What would that create? In 1932, a deer hunter named Vernon Mills found a cave system approximately 8 miles from the original Harrow homestead. Inside one of the deeper chambers, he discovered what he described as a nest: piles of stolen blankets, tin plates, and dozens of small bones arranged in careful patterns. Most disturbing was a collection of objects clearly taken from campsites and cabins over many years: a harmonica, children's toys, a dented pocket watch, and a piece of rotted fabric that textile analysis later suggested was from an 1850s-era dress. Someone had been living in that cave, on and off, for decades. Mills also found scratches on the cave walls, not random marks, but deliberate drawings. Stick figures, a crude representation of a house with people standing outside. And one image repeated multiple times throughout the chamber: a family of figures, with one separated from the others, standing alone. Isolation leaves its signature in stone. The cave was photographed, documented, and then largely forgotten as the Great Depression consumed public attention. But researchers in the 1970s, during a renewed interest in Appalachian criminal history, revisited the site and conducted carbon dating on organic materials. The results suggested occupation from approximately the mid-1850s through the early 1920s, a span of 70 years. If Thomas Harrow had been abandoned at age 9 or 10 in 1852, he would have been in his late 80s by the 1920s. Survival that long in wilderness conditions would have been extraordinary but not impossible, especially for someone who'd grown up in the mountains and learned basic survival skills before his exile. The question became, if Thomas survived, what did he become? Josiah's final interview, conducted months before his death in 1911, offered one chilling detail he'd never mentioned before. When asked if he thought Thomas could have lived, he said, "My father trained us to be hunters. Even Thomas learned some of it before they sent him away. And Thomas was always watching, always learning, even when people thought he wasn't paying attention. If anyone could survive out there alone, it would be him." Then Josiah added something that the interviewer noted made the old man's hands shake. "But I hope to God he didn't. Because if Thomas lived all those years alone in those mountains, carrying what our family did, carrying what they tried to make him do, I don't think whatever came out of those woods was my brother anymore." The modern search for Thomas Harrow has become something of an obsession for true crime researchers and Appalachian historians. Several expeditions have been mounted to explore the cave systems and deep forest areas where sightings were reported. They've found more evidence of long-term primitive habitation: fire pits, tool marks, the remains of shelters, but nothing definitive, no bones, no conclusive proof of identity. The last confirmed sighting was in 1926. A young girl named Dorothy Keene, aged 7, was playing near her family's farm when she encountered what she described as the tallest, thinnest man I ever saw, with hair down to his waist and clothes made of animal skins. She said he watched her from the trees for several minutes, then whispered something she couldn't quite hear and vanished into the forest. When asked what she thought he said, Dorothy replied, "It sounded like sorry." After 1926, the sightings stopped. Either Thomas Harrow finally died, or he moved deeper into wilderness where human contact became impossible. But here's what keeps researchers awake. If Thomas survived into the 1920s, he could have fathered children of his own. Wild, isolated, raised without civilization's constraints. And those children could have had children, creating a lineage that carries Harrow blood, but exists completely outside documented society. The mountains are vast. There are valleys no government survey has ever mapped. hollows where families still live off-grid and suspicious of outsiders. Could fragments of the Harrow bloodline persist there, carrying forward the legacy in ways we'll never detect? Most investigators say no. They argue the evidence is too thin, the sightings too unreliable, and the whole Thomas Harrow theory is simply folklore built on coincidence and a single overlooked birth record. But on quiet nights in Appalachian towns near the Old Territory, people still tell their children not to wander too far into the woods alone. The Harrow homestead burned in 1897, 34 years after the hangings. No one knew who set the fire. It might have been lightning, vandals, or someone who simply couldn't stand the thought of those walls still standing. By dawn, nothing remained except the stone chimney and the root cellar entrance, both eventually swallowed by kudzu and neglect. The county quietly removed the location from official maps. Tour guides stopped mentioning it. Within 2 generations, most locals claimed they'd never heard the name Harrow at all. America has always been good at forgetting what makes it uncomfortable. But erasure from maps doesn't equal erasure from memory. And the Harrow case has experienced multiple resurrections over the past century and a half. Each generation rediscovers it, reinterprets it, and asks the same fundamental questions. How does a family descend into systematic murder? How does a community allow it? And most unsettling, could it happen again? The psychological profile of Micah Harrow has fascinated criminal experts since the 1920s, when the emerging field of criminal psychology began examining historical cases. Dr. Helena Vickers, in her 1968 study, Patriarchal Violence in Frontier America, argued that Micah represented a specific type of family annihilator. Not someone who kills his own family, but someone who weaponizes his family, turning the domestic structure itself into a murder apparatus. He didn't create killers, Vickers wrote. He created a culture where killing was normalized, rationalized, and rewarded. The children weren't psychopaths. They were believers in a moral system their father constructed from scratch. That distinction matters. Most of Micah's children weren't born monsters. They were systematically conditioned through childhood to view human beings as resources, strangers as threats or opportunities, and violence as an acceptable solution to scarcity. Caleb, the eldest, showed signs of sadism that might have been inherent. But Daniel and even Josiah functioned more as soldiers following orders in a war only their father understood. The case raises uncomfortable questions about culpability. When does participation become complicity? When does complicity become guilt? Josiah ultimately betrayed his family and testified against his father, but he'd still participated in murders for 23 years before his conscience overwhelmed his conditioning. Does his final act of resistance absolve the previous decades? Legal scholars still debate this. Josiah was never charged. He'd been granted immunity in exchange for testimony, but public opinion remained divided until his death. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a victim of his upbringing who finally found courage. Others saw a murderer who escaped justice by betraying accomplices. Redemption is a story we tell ourselves. The dead don't get to vote on its accuracy. The broader community's role has received less attention historically, but is perhaps more damning. Sheriff Breckinridge's acceptance of bribes was criminal, but what about the merchants who asked no questions? The neighbors who heard rumors but stayed silent? The circuit preacher who noticed something wrong but chose doubt over action? In 2006, sociologist Dr. Marcus Hadley published The Ecology of Evil, examining how communities create conditions for predatory families to thrive. His research on the Harrow case identified what he called conspiracy through inattention, not active collaboration, but a collective decision to not look too closely, to not connect dots, to preserve social equilibrium at the cost of strangers' lives. The Harrows didn't operate in a vacuum, Hadley wrote. They operated in a social environment that had decided their victims didn't matter enough to investigate. That's not ignorance. That's choice. Modern parallels aren't hard to find. Cases of long-term abuse, trafficking, and violence often persist because communities choose stability over intervention, because investigating means admitting complicity, because the victims are people society has already marginalized. The Harrow case is a mirror, and what it reflects hasn't changed much in 160 years. But perhaps the most persistent legacy is the question of Thomas Harrow and what he represents. The ghost child, the lost brother, the bloodline that might have continued. Amateur investigators still trek into the Appalachian wilderness searching for evidence, posting their findings on forums and YouTube channels, constructing elaborate theories about wild families living off-grid, carrying forward the Harrow methodology in modified form. Most of this is fantasy, the human need to extend a story beyond its natural conclusion. But not all of it. In 2019, hikers in eastern Kentucky discovered a hidden valley accessible only through a narrow ravine that GPS mapping had missed. Inside were the remains of a settlement, rough cabins, animal pens, fire pits, abandoned perhaps 20 years prior based on weathering patterns. Among the debris, investigators found carved wooden figures remarkably similar to the stick figure drawings found in Thomas Harrow's cave nearly 90 years earlier. They also found bones, animal bones, arranged in patterns, and one human skull, male, showing signs of trauma consistent with violence. The skull was too degraded for DNA analysis, and without dental records or identifying features, its origin remains unknown. Was it Thomas Harrow, finally dead after decades of wilderness survival? A descendant? A random victim of completely unrelated violence? We'll likely never know. But the discovery reignited speculation. If Thomas had survived and reproduced, his descendants would carry Harrow DNA. They would have been raised in isolation, without socialization, potentially inheriting both genetic predispositions and learned behaviors from a man who'd been traumatized by his family's crimes, but also trained in their methods. What would that lineage look like after 4 or 5 generations? Would the violence persist, or would distance and dilution erase it? Would they even know their own history, or would it have decayed into distorted family myth? In 2023, a genetic genealogy company reported an anomaly. A DNA sample submitted for ancestry testing showed markers consistent with Appalachian populations, but couldn't be connected to any existing family trees in their database. The sample came from someone using a pseudonym and a prepaid credit card, untraceable. When researchers tried to follow up, the account had been deleted. The submission location? Eastern Kentucky, less than 15 miles from the former Harrow territory. Coincidence? Almost certainly. But it's the kind of detail that keeps the legend alive, that feeds the possibility that somewhere in those mountains, someone carries the blood of America's most methodical family killers. The truth is probably more mundane. Thomas Harrow likely died alone in the wilderness sometime in the early 20th century, his body consumed by scavengers, his story lost to time. The sightings were misidentifications, the cave evidence circumstantial, the genetic anomaly just statistical noise. But truth has never been as powerful as the fear that it might not be complete. Families still go missing in the Appalachian region every year, usually explained by accidents, voluntary disappearance, or natural causes. The vast majority are resolved without mystery. But occasionally one remains unexplained. A hiker who vanished on a marked trail. A couple whose car was found empty miles from civilization. Children who wandered from a campsite and were never seen again. And in the online forums where true crime enthusiasts gather, someone always posts the same question. How far is this from Harrow territory? As if distance could measure the reach of a legacy built on blood. The Appalachian Butcher Clan, as sensationalist headlines eventually dubbed them, killed at least 62 people and likely many more. They operated for 3 decades in plain sight, enabled by poverty, isolation, and a community that chose complicity over confrontation. They were stopped not by diligent law enforcement, but by one man's psychological breaking point. And even then, questions remain about whether every branch of that poisoned family tree was truly cut down. The story should be a relic, a historical atrocity safely contained in the 19th century. Instead, it's a warning about how easily society can look away when the victims are invisible, how family can become cult, and how the wilderness, both geographical and moral, provides cover for the worst human impulses. Somewhere in the Appalachian highlands, beneath layers of leaf mold and decades of forest growth, pieces of the Harrow story remain buried. Personal effects that were never cataloged, victims who were never counted, and possibly, just possibly, descendants who don't even know the weight of the name they carry. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes, late at night when wind moves through the hollows, it sounds like screaming. But it's probably just the wind. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.